The morning Clara Mitchell placed her hands on the dying soldier's chest, she had no idea her touch would ignite a controversy that would shake the foundations of military medicine and challenge everything the medical establishment believed about healing. What happened in that makeshift field hospital outside Richmond, Virginia, would eventually transform how America treated its wounded warriors. But it began with a girl who had never spoken a word, and a man who couldn't feel anything at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1863 had painted the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty of the season was lost on those who inhabited the sprawling military encampment that had grown like a desperate city around the Confederate stronghold of Richmond. Among the sea of canvas tents and wooden barracks that housed thousands of wounded soldiers, one structure stood apart from the rest. A converted tobacco warehouse that had been hastily transformed into a field hospital where the most critically injured men fought their final battles against death. Clara Mitchell moved through the rows of wounded soldiers like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound against the rough wooden planks that served as flooring. At 19, she possessed an ethereal quality that seemed almost otherworldly in the harsh environment of war. Her long auburn hair was always pulled back in a simple braid, and her grey eyes held a depth of compassion that spoke volumes despite her inability to voice a single word. She had been born mute, a condition that had initially made her an object of pity in her small hometown of Millbrook, Virginia. But here, among the dying and desperate, her silence had become her greatest strength. The girl had arrived at the field hospital 3 months earlier, accompanying her older brother Thomas when he enlisted as a medical orderly. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the chief physician overseeing the facility, had initially been reluctant to allow a young woman, particularly one who couldn't communicate verbally, to remain in such a grim environment. But Clara had quietly begun assisting with basic tasks, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, bringing water to thirsty soldiers, and sitting beside men who were dying far from home. It was during these quiet moments of care that something extraordinary began to happen. Soldiers who had been writhing in agony would grow calm under Clara's gentle touch. Men who had been consumed by fever would find their temperatures dropping after she placed her cool hands on their burning foreheads. Wounds that had been festering and refusing to heal would begin showing signs of improvement after Clara spent time cleaning and dressing them with her characteristic gentle precision. At first, Dr. Hartwell attributed these improvements to coincidence or the natural healing process. As a man of science educated at the Medical College of Virginia, he believed in empirical evidence and proven medical procedures. The idea that a young mute woman could possess some form of healing ability seemed preposterous, a relic of superstitious thinking that had no place in modern medicine. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Sergeant William Crawford, a farmer from North Carolina who had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen, had been expected to die within days of his arrival. His wounds were too severe, the infection too advanced, and his body too weakened by blood loss for any reasonable hope of recovery. Yet after Clara began spending time by his bedside, gently cleaning his wounds and placing her hands on his chest while he slept, something remarkable occurred. The inflammation began to subside, the infection cleared, and within 2 weeks, Crawford was sitting up and asking for real food instead of the thin broth that had been his only sustenance. Private James Sullivan from Tennessee had suffered a head injury that left him blind and confused, thrashing violently whenever anyone approached his bed. The medical staff had been forced to restrain him to prevent him from injuring himself or others. But when Clara approached his bedside and gently placed her hands on his temples, Sullivan immediately grew calm. She would sit with him for hours, her hands resting lightly on his forehead, and gradually his vision began to return. Within a month, he was walking around the hospital, helping other patients, and speaking of Clara with an almost religious reverence. The stories multiplied with each passing week. Corporal Daniel Hayes, whose arm had been mangled by cannon fire and was scheduled for amputation, regained full use of his limb after Clara spent days working with the damaged tissue. Private Robert Stone, who had been rendered deaf by an explosion, began to hear again after Clara regularly placed her hands over his ears during his afternoon rest periods. Lieutenant Michael Foster, whose leg wound had become so infected that gangrene was setting in, found the blackened tissue returning to healthy pink after Clara's daily ministrations. Dr. Hartwell found himself in an impossible position. His medical training told him that what he was witnessing defied scientific explanation, yet the evidence was undeniable. Soldiers who should have died were recovering. Men who should have been permanently disabled were regaining their abilities. The mortality rate in his section of the hospital had dropped dramatically since Clara's arrival, and word was beginning to spread throughout the encampment about the angel girl who could heal with her touch. The medical establishment's response was predictably skeptical. Dr. Marcus Blackwood, the chief military surgeon for the region, arrived for an unannounced inspection after hearing rumors about unusual healing practices. A stern man in his 50s, with decades of battlefield medicine experience, Blackwood believed that war had no place for sentimentality or unproven treatments. He had seen too many good soldiers die from infections, complications, and wounds that could have been treated more aggressively to tolerate what he viewed as dangerous folklore. Dr. Hartwell, Blackwood said during his inspection, his voice carrying the authority of military rank and medical expertise, "I'm told you're allowing an untrained civilian, a woman no less, to treat wounded soldiers using methods that have no basis in medical science. This is not only unprofessional, it's potentially deadly." Dr. Hartwell had prepared for this confrontation, assembling detailed records of patient outcomes and recovery rates that documented the remarkable improvements occurring under Clara's care. "Sir, I understand your concerns, but the results speak for themselves. Our mortality rate has decreased by 30% since Miss Mitchell began assisting with patient care. Recovery times have been cut in half for many types of injuries. I can show you specific cases where soldiers who were expected to die have made complete recoveries." Blackwood's expression remained skeptical as he reviewed the medical records. "Correlation is not causation, Doctor. The fact that outcomes have improved doesn't mean this girl's touch is responsible. There could be any number of factors: changes in weather, improvements in supply lines, natural fluctuations in disease patterns. What you're suggesting borders on mysticism, and mysticism has no place in military medicine." The debate that followed revealed fundamental differences in medical philosophy that extended far beyond Clara's unusual abilities. Dr. Hartwell represented a growing movement within medicine that recognized the importance of holistic care, patient comfort, and the mysterious aspects of healing that couldn't be easily quantified or explained. Dr. Blackwood embodied the traditional approach that prioritized proven procedures, surgical intervention, and skepticism toward anything that couldn't be measured or replicated in controlled conditions. "I'm not claiming to understand how Miss Mitchell achieves these results," Dr. Hartwell explained carefully. "I'm simply documenting what I observe. Soldiers under her care recover faster, experience less pain, and show fewer complications than statistical averages would predict. As physicians, shouldn't we be investigating promising treatments rather than dismissing them because they don't fit our current understanding?" The tension reached a critical point when Dr. Blackwood demanded a formal demonstration of Clara's abilities. He selected Corporal Benjamin Wright, a young soldier from Kentucky whose chest wound had been infected for weeks and was showing signs of pneumonia. Wright's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional treatment had proven ineffective. "If this girl truly has healing abilities," Blackwood declared, "let her demonstrate them under controlled conditions. I want to observe her methods firsthand and document any changes in the patient's condition." Clara, who had been quietly listening to the conversation while organizing medical supplies, approached Corporal Wright's bedside with her characteristic calm composure. The young soldier was barely conscious, his breathing labored and his skin pale from blood loss and infection. She gently pulled back his shirt to expose the wound, a ragged tear across his ribs that had refused to heal properly despite multiple cleanings and dressing changes. What happened next would be debated in medical circles for years to come. Clara placed her hands directly on the infected wound, her fingers barely touching the inflamed tissue. She closed her eyes and remained motionless for several minutes, her breathing deep and regular. Dr. Blackwood watched with scientific skepticism, taking notes on her positioning, technique, and the duration of her contact with the patient. Gradually, something remarkable began to occur. The angry red color around the wound's edges began to fade. The swelling that had made the tissue tight and painful started to subside. Most dramatically, the foul-smelling discharge that had been leaking from the wound slowed and then stopped entirely. Corporal Wright's labored breathing became easier, and his skin began to regain some of its natural color. Dr. Blackwood observed these changes with growing amazement and concern. As a man of science, he sought rational explanations for what he was witnessing. Perhaps the wound had reached a natural turning point in its healing process. Maybe the cleaning and preparation had finally removed enough infected material to allow recovery to begin. There had to be a logical medical explanation for the improvements he was documenting. But as Clara continued her gentle ministrations over the following days, Wright's recovery accelerated beyond anything that conventional medicine could explain. The infection cleared completely. Healthy tissue began forming over the wound, and the young soldier's strength returned with remarkable speed. Within a week, he was walking around the hospital and expressing his intention to return to his unit. The implications of Wright's recovery extended far beyond individual medical outcomes. If Clara truly possessed some form of healing ability, it challenged fundamental assumptions about medicine, treatment, and the nature of healing itself. More immediately, it raised questions about how such abilities should be utilized in a military context where thousands of soldiers were suffering from wounds and conditions that conventional medicine couldn't adequately address. Dr. Blackwood found himself facing a crisis of professional conviction. His medical training and scientific background told him that what he had witnessed was impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. He had personally observed and documented improvements that defied medical explanation, occurring in direct correlation with Clara's interventions. The debate about Clara's abilities soon extended beyond the confines of the field hospital. Officers, enlisted men, and medical personnel throughout the encampment began discussing the miracle girl whose touch could heal wounds that traditional medicine couldn't treat. Some viewed her as a divine gift, a sign of God's favor in their desperate struggle. Others saw her as a dangerous distraction from proven medical procedures, a source of false hope that could lead to neglect of established treatments. Clara herself remained largely unaware of the controversies swirling around her. Unable to participate in the verbal debates about her abilities, she continued her quiet work among the wounded soldiers, moving from bed to bed with the same gentle compassion that had characterized her care from the beginning. Her focus remained entirely on the immediate needs of individual patients, cleaning wounds, providing comfort, and offering the healing touch that seemed to ease suffering in ways that conventional medicine couldn't match. But the arrival of a New patient would soon test Clara's abilities in ways that none of them could have anticipated, creating challenges that would transform not only her understanding of her gift, but the entire trajectory of military medicine in the Civil War era. The patient's name was Captain Marcus Stone, and he would prove to be unlike any soldier Claraara had ever encountered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The stretcher bearers who carried Captain Marcus Stone into the field hospital moved with the careful urgency reserved for officers, but their faces bore expressions of grim resignation rather than hope. Stone had been unconscious for 3 days since the explosion that had torn through his company during a reconnaissance mission near Petersburg. The blast had left him with multiple injuries, severe burns across his back and arms, deep lacerations from flying debris, and what appeared to be significant head trauma that had rendered him comatose. Dr. Hartwell examined the new patient with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the Confederate Medical Corps. Stone's wounds were extensive, but not necessarily fatal if properly treated. The burns were serious, but covered less than 30% of his body. The lacerations were deep but clean, suggesting they would heal well with proper care. The head injury showed no obvious signs of skull fracture, though the prolonged unconsciousness was concerning. What troubled Dr. Hartwell most was not the captain's injuries, but his complete lack of response to painful stimuli. When the doctor cleaned the wounds with alcohol, Stone showed no reaction. When he probed the deeper lacerations to check for foreign objects, the patient remained utterly still. Even when Dr. Hartwell deliberately applied pressure to areas that should have caused significant pain, Stone's face remained peaceful, his breathing steady and undisturbed. "Has he shown any response since the injury?" Dr. Hartwell asked Lieutenant Samuel Rogers, Stone's aide-de-camp who had accompanied the stretcher-bearers. Rogers shook his head grimly. "Nothing, sir. We thought he was dead at first. No reaction to sound, touch, or pain, but his breathing and pulse have remained steady. It's as if he's trapped somewhere between life and death." Dr. Hartwell had encountered similar cases before, soldiers whose nervous systems had been so severely traumatized that they lost the ability to feel physical sensations. Sometimes the condition was temporary, resolving as the brain healed from its injuries. Other times, it proved permanent, leaving men alive but fundamentally disconnected from their physical bodies. In Stone's case, the complete absence of pain response suggested damage to the neural pathways that transmitted sensory information, though the exact nature and extent of that damage remained unclear. Claraara had been assisting Dr. Hartwell with Stone's initial examination, cleaning instruments, and preparing bandages with her usual quiet efficiency. She watched the doctor's increasingly puzzled expressions as he attempted to elicit responses from the unconscious captain. When Dr. Hartwell stepped away to consult his medical texts about similar cases, Claraara approached Stone's bedside with the same gentle manner she brought to all her patients. She began with her standard approach, gently placing her hands on Stone's forehead to assess his condition through touch. Immediately, she sensed something different about this patient. Where other soldiers radiated pain, fear, or the chaotic energy of bodies fighting to heal, Stone emanated nothing. It was as if her healing sensitivity encountered a void where a person's physical awareness should have been. Claraara had never encountered anything like this absence of sensation. Her gift had always worked by connecting with patients' pain, somehow, drawing the suffering into herself and transforming it into healing energy. With Stone, there was no pain to absorb, no suffering to transform. Her hands rested on his skin, but she felt no connection, no flow of healing energy between them. Disturbed by this unprecedented experience, Clara spent the entire night sitting beside Stone's bed, her hands resting lightly on his chest as she tried to understand what was different about him. She had never failed to help a patient before, and Stone's complete unresponsiveness to her touch left her feeling helpless in a way she had never experienced. On the second day of Stone's hospitalization, something remarkable occurred. The captain's eyes opened, revealing deep brown irises that seemed to focus with perfect clarity on his surroundings. He turned his head to survey the hospital ward, taking in the rows of wounded soldiers, the medical equipment, and the staff. Moving between patients, his expression showed complete awareness and intelligence, but no emotion whatsoever. "Captain Stone," Dr. Hartwell said, approaching the bed with cautious optimism. "Can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" Stone's eyes focused on the doctor with perfect clarity. He opened his mouth and spoke in a voice that was clear and strong, showing no signs of confusion or disorientation. "I'm in a field hospital. You're Dr. Hartwell. I can see your name on your uniform. I remember the explosion that brought me here." The captain's mental faculties appeared completely intact, but his emotional tone was utterly flat, as if he were discussing the weather rather than his own near-death experience. Dr. Hartwell proceeded with a standard neurological examination, testing Stone's cognitive functions, memory, and reasoning abilities. Every response was perfect, demonstrating that whatever had happened to the captain's nervous system, his intellectual capabilities remained unimpaired. "Captain, I need to test your physical responses," Dr. Hartwell explained, producing a medical pin. "I'm going to touch various parts of your body with this instrument. Please tell me what you feel." What followed was perhaps the most disturbing medical examination Dr. Hartwell had ever conducted. As he methodically tested Stone's responses to touch, pressure, heat, and pain throughout his body, the captain reported feeling absolutely nothing. He could see the pin touching his skin, could observe the doctor's movements, but experienced no physical sensations whatsoever. "It's quite fascinating, actually," Stone observed with the same emotionless tone he had maintained throughout the examination. "I can see you touching my arm, but it might as well be happening to someone else. There's no connection between what I observe and what I experience." The implications of Stone's condition extended far beyond medical curiosity. A soldier who couldn't feel pain would be unable to recognize injuries, infections, or other physical problems that required immediate attention. He might walk on a broken leg until it became permanently damaged, or ignore infected wounds until they became life-threatening. More troubling still was the emotional flatness that accompanied his physical numbness, as if the ability to feel pain was somehow connected to the capacity for all emotional experience. Clara observed these examinations with growing fascination and concern. She had never encountered a person who was completely cut off from physical sensation, and Stone's condition challenged everything she understood about healing. Her gift had always worked by connecting with patients suffering, but how could she help someone who felt nothing at all? Over the following days, Stone's physical wounds began healing at a normal rate, despite his inability to feel them. The burns on his back formed healthy scabs, the lacerations closed cleanly, and there were no signs of infection. From a purely medical standpoint, his recovery was proceeding exactly as expected, but his emotional state remained as flat and disconnected as it had been since awakening. Stone interacted with doctors, nurses, and other patients with perfect politeness and intellectual engagement, but no emotional warmth or genuine human connection. He could discuss philosophy, literature, and military strategy with remarkable insight, but showed no joy, sadness, anger, or fear. It was as if the explosion had severed not just his ability to feel physical pain, but his capacity for emotional experience as well. Dr. Hartwell consulted every medical text and colleague he could reach, seeking some precedent for Stone's condition. He found scattered references to soldiers who had lost physical sensation after severe head injuries, but nothing that addressed the complete emotional numbness that accompanied Stone's physical condition. Most troubling was the growing realization that conventional medicine had no treatments for this type of neurological damage. Clara's nightly vigils beside Stone's bed became a source of both frustration and determination. Every healing technique she had ever developed proved useless against his condition. Her hands, which had brought comfort and healing to hundreds of wounded soldiers, felt nothing when she touched Stone's skin. It was like trying to warm a stone. With candlelight, the heat had nowhere to go, no way to connect with the object it was meant to affect. But Clara refused to give up. Something about Stone's condition spoke to her on a level that transcended her usual healing instincts. Perhaps it was the recognition that he was as isolated from the world as she was, though for entirely different reasons. Where her muteness cut her off from verbal communication, his numbness severed him from all physical and emotional connection. They were both trapped in separate worlds, unable to reach out to others in the ways that most people took for granted. The breakthrough came during Clara's 5th night of sitting with Stone. She had been resting her hands on his chest, trying to sense any flicker of response, when she realized she was approaching his condition entirely wrong. Instead of trying to reach into his numbness with healing energy, she began to simply share his silence. She sat quietly beside him, not trying to heal or change anything, but simply being present with him in his isolation. To her amazement, Stone turned his head and looked directly at her for the first time since awakening. "You're the girl they call the angel," he said, his voice still flat but carrying a note of curiosity. "I've been watching you work with the other patients. They all seem to improve after you touch them." Clara nodded, maintaining eye contact with an intensity that surprised them both. For the first time since his injury, Stone seemed to be truly seeing another person rather than simply observing them. There was something in his gaze that suggested a glimmer of connection, as if Clara's silent presence had somehow reached through. His emotional numbness. "You can't help me, can you?" Stone continued, his tone matter-of-fact rather than disappointed. "I can see you trying, but whatever you do for the others doesn't work on me. I'm too far gone, too disconnected from everything that makes healing possible." Clara shook her head firmly, placing her hand over her heart and then touching his chest, in a gesture that conveyed her refusal to give up. She had never accepted defeat before, and she wasn't about to start with Stone. His condition might be unlike anything she had encountered, but that only meant she needed to discover new approaches to reach him. The interaction marked the beginning of a unique relationship between two people who existed on the margins of normal human experience. Clara's inability to speak and Stone's inability to feel created a strange compatibility, two forms of isolation that somehow complemented each other. She began spending more time at his bedside, not trying to heal him in her usual way, but simply sharing his silence and offering a form of companionship that didn't require conventional emotional responses. Stone, for his part, seemed to find Clara's presence less disturbing than that of other people. Her silence meant he didn't have to pretend to feel emotions he couldn't access. Her gentle touch, while unable to heal his numbness, at least didn't demand responses he couldn't provide. In her company, he could exist without the exhausting effort of simulating normal human reactions for the benefit of others. But their growing connection would soon face challenges that neither of them anticipated. Dr. Blackwood's investigation into Clara's healing abilities was intensifying, and Stone's unusual condition was attracting attention from military officials who saw potential, advantages in a soldier who couldn't feel pain. The peaceful bubble of the field hospital was about to be shattered by forces that would test both Clara's healing gifts and Stone's capacity for human connection in ways that would change both of their lives forever. Colonel Harrison Blackwell arrived at the field hospital on a cold November morning, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from one of medical urgency to military formality. As the chief inspector for the Confederate Army's Medical Corps, Blackwell possessed the authority to shut down entire medical facilities, transfer personnel, and implement sweeping changes to battlefield medicine protocols. His reputation for rigid adherence to military regulations and skepticism toward unconventional treatments had preceded him, creating an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone from Dr. Hartwell to the lowest-ranking orderlies. The colonel's investigation had been triggered by reports that reached Richmond about extraordinary healing phenomena occurring at the field hospital. These reports, initially dismissed as battlefield folklore, had gained credibility when they began appearing in official medical dispatches and casualty reports. The statistics were undeniable. Mortality rates at Dr. Hartwell's facility had dropped to levels that seemed statistically impossible, while recovery times for serious injuries had been cut dramatically compared to other military medical facilities. Dr. Hartwell had spent the previous week preparing for this inspection, assembling comprehensive medical records, patient testimonials, and detailed documentation of treatment protocols. He knew that Clara's unusual abilities would be the focus of Blackwell's investigation, and he had worked to present her contributions in the most scientifically credible manner possible. However, he also understood that military medicine prioritized proven procedures and standardized treatments over individual innovations, regardless of their effectiveness. Clara herself seemed largely unaware of the controversy surrounding her work. She continued her daily rounds among the wounded soldiers, providing the same gentle care that had characterized her presence in the hospital from the beginning. Her relationship with Captain Stone had evolved into something unique, a daily ritual of shared silence that seemed to provide both of them with a form of companionship that neither had found elsewhere. Stone's condition remained unchanged from a medical standpoint. He could see, hear, think, and speak with perfect clarity, but felt no physical sensations and displayed no emotional responses. Dr. Hartwell had documented every aspect of his case, hoping that Stone's condition might provide insights into the neurological basis of sensation and healing. More immediately, Stone's complete unresponsiveness to Clara's touch had become a puzzling exception to her otherwise consistent healing abilities. Colonel Blackwell's first day of investigation focused on reviewing medical records and interviewing staff members about treatment protocols. His approach was methodical and thorough, examining patient files, casualty statistics, and supply usage patterns with the precision of a military auditor. What he discovered challenged his preconceptions about battlefield medicine and forced him to confront evidence that defied conventional medical understanding. Dr. Hartwell, Blackwell said during their formal interview, his voice carrying the authority of rank and years of military service, "These casualty statistics are remarkable. Your mortality rate is 37% lower than the average for similar facilities, and your infection rates are nearly 50% below standard expectations. How do you explain these outcomes?" Dr. Hartwell had prepared extensively for this question, but he knew that any mention of Clara's healing abilities would be met with skepticism or outright disbelief. "Sir, we've implemented several innovations in patient care that I believe contribute to improved outcomes. Enhanced wound cleaning protocols, more frequent dressing changes, improved nutrition when supplies allow, and what I would characterize as intensive individual attention to patient needs." The colonel's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the documentation. I see references throughout these files to a civilian assistant named Clara Mitchell. What exactly is her role in patient treatment? Miss Mitchell assists with basic patient care under medical supervision, Dr. Hartwell replied carefully. She helps with wound cleaning, provides comfort to dying soldiers, and performs other supportive functions that free medical staff to focus on more complex procedures. Blackwell's investigation intensified when he began interviewing recovered soldiers who remained at the facility in various support roles. Their testimonials about Clara's healing abilities were consistent, but sounded more like religious testimony than medical reports. Sergeant Crawford spoke of miraculous recovery from what should have been fatal wounds. Private Sullivan described regaining his sight after Clara's touch. Corporal Hayes demonstrated full use of an arm that had been scheduled for amputation before Clara's intervention. These men seem to believe that Miss Mitchell possesses some form of supernatural healing ability, Blackwell observed to Dr. Hartwell after completing his interviews. Such beliefs are dangerous in a military context where soldiers need to rely on proven medical procedures rather than folklore and superstition. The colonel's skepticism deepened when he observed Clara working with patients. Her methods appeared to consist of nothing more than gentle touch, quiet presence, and basic nursing care. There were no special techniques, no unusual equipment, no procedures that couldn't be performed by any competent medical assistant. Yet the soldiers responded to her presence with an almost reverential attitude that troubled Blackwell's sense of military order and discipline. Captain Stone's case presented a particularly intriguing element of the investigation. Here was a soldier whose conditions seemed to provide a natural control group for testing Clara's abilities. If she truly possessed healing powers, Stone's complete unresponsiveness to her touch suggested either limitations to her abilities or evidence that his condition was beyond any form of treatment. Blackwell observed one of Clara's sessions with Stone, watching as she sat quietly beside his bed with her hands resting on his chest. Stone remained as emotionally flat and physically unresponsive as ever, showing no signs of improvement despite weeks of Clara's attention. For Blackwell, this represented proof that Clara's other successes could be explained by conventional medical factors rather than supernatural intervention. Captain Stone, Blackwell addressed the patient directly. I understand that Miss Mitchell has been attempting to treat your condition. Have you experienced any changes or improvements since these sessions began? Stone's response was characteristically emotionless but intellectually precise. No physical changes, Colonel. I remain unable to feel any sensations or experience emotional responses. However, I find Miss Mitchell's presence less disturbing than that of others. Her silence matches my numbness in a way that seems appropriate. The answer intrigued Blackwell more than he expected. Stone's intellectual clarity and emotional honesty provided a unique perspective on Clara's methods that differed from the almost mystical reverence expressed by other patients. Here was a man who couldn't be influenced by emotional manipulation or wishful thinking, yet he acknowledged some form of benefit from Clara's presence. The investigation took a dramatic turn when a new crisis struck the hospital. A supply convoy carrying critically needed medical materials had been attacked by Union forces, destroying most of the morphine, surgical instruments, and bandages that the facility depended upon. With wounded soldiers continuing to arrive daily and existing supplies dwindling rapidly, Dr. Hartwell faced the prospect of performing amputations and other procedures without adequate pain relief or proper equipment. The shortage crisis forced Colonel Blackwell to observe the hospital's operations under extreme stress, providing a real-time test of their ability to maintain care quality despite resource limitations. What he witnessed challenged his assumptions about military medicine and the role that unconventional approaches might play in crisis situations. Clara's response to the supply shortage demonstrated aspects of her abilities that hadn't been apparent. During normal operations, with morphine unavailable for pain management, she began spending extended periods with soldiers undergoing procedures, her touch seeming to provide comfort that pharmaceuticals might have offered. Patients who should have been screaming in agony during wound cleaning and bandage changes remained calm under her gentle hands. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a young physician who had recently joined the hospital staff, observed Clara's work during the crisis with amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Colonel Blackwell," he reported, "I've just completed a leg amputation on Private Jackson with no morphine available." Miss Mitchell held his hand throughout the procedure, and he showed minimal signs of distress. "I've never seen anything like it." The colonel witnessed this phenomenon firsthand when he observed Claraara assisting with emergency surgery on Lieutenant David Palmer, whose arm had been shattered by grape shot. Without anesthesia available, the procedure should have been unbearable for the patient and traumatic for the medical staff. Instead, Palmer remained conscious but calm throughout the operation, his eyes fixed on Clara's face as she maintained gentle contact with his uninjured arm. "Miss Mitchell," Blackwell addressed Claraara directly after the surgery, speaking slowly and clearly since he had learned of her muteness. "What exactly do you do during these procedures? What techniques are you employing to help these patients manage pain?" Clara's response came through gestures and expressions that had become her primary form of communication. She placed her hand over her heart, then reached out to touch the colonel's arm gently, her eyes conveying compassion and concern that transcended the need for words. The gesture was simple, but somehow profound, suggesting that her healing abilities stemmed from genuine empathy rather than medical technique. The supply crisis also revealed Stone's unique potential value in military contexts. His inability to feel pain meant that he could continue functioning even with injuries that would incapacitate normal soldiers. When he volunteered to help move medical supplies despite having wounds that hadn't fully healed, he demonstrated capabilities that intrigued Blackwell from a strategic standpoint. "Captain Stone," the colonel said during a private conversation, "your condition, while medically concerning, might offer certain advantages in combat situations. A soldier who cannot feel pain could potentially continue fighting despite injuries. That would stop others." Stone's response was characteristically analytical. "That's true, Colonel, but it also means I might not recognize life-threatening injuries until it's too late to treat them. The inability to feel pain is a double-edged sword that requires constant vigilance to avoid serious complications." The conversation highlighted one of the central paradoxes of Stone's condition. While his numbness might offer tactical advantages, it also created vulnerabilities that could prove fatal in combat situations. The relationship between pain and survival was more complex than simple military thinking might suggest. As the supply crisis extended into its second week, Colonel Blackwell found himself reassessing his initial skepticism about Clara's abilities. While he couldn't accept supernatural explanations for her successes, he couldn't deny the practical value of her presence during medical emergencies. Patients under her care required less medication, showed fewer signs of trauma, and seemed to recover more quickly than statistical averages would predict. The investigation's most significant development came when Blackwell decided to conduct a formal experiment to test Clara's abilities under controlled conditions. Working with Dr. Hartwell, he designed a protocol that would document Clara's effects on patient outcomes while eliminating as many variables as possible. The experiment would involve two groups of patients with similar injuries. One group would receive standard medical care, while the other would receive the same care plus Clara's attention. This experiment will either validate Miss Mitchell's contributions to patient care or demonstrate that the improvements we've observed can be attributed to other factors, Blackwell explained to Dr. Hartwell. Either way, We'll have scientific data to guide future medical policies and procedures. The formal experiment would mark a turning point in Clara's story, forcing her abilities into the harsh light of military scrutiny while potentially validating healing methods that challenged everything the medical establishment believed about treatment and recovery. But the experiment would also reveal new dimensions to her relationship with Stone, as his unique condition provided insights into the nature of healing that none of them had anticipated. As preparations for the experiment began, Clara continued her quiet work among the wounded soldiers, unaware that her abilities were about to be subjected to the most rigorous testing of her young life. The gentle touch that had brought comfort and healing to hundreds of soldiers would soon face the ultimate challenge, proving its worth to a military establishment that valued proof over miracles and procedures over compassion. The controlled experiment, designed by Colonel Blackwell, began on a grey December morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood pervading the field hospital. 20 wounded soldiers had been carefully selected and divided into 2 groups based on the severity and type of their injuries. Group A would receive standard military medical care, while Group B would receive identical treatment plus Clara's healing touch. Every aspect of their care would be documented, measured, and analyzed to determine whether Clara's presence produced measurable improvements in patient outcomes. Dr. Hartwell had spent weeks developing the experimental protocols, working closely with Colonel Blackwell to ensure that the study would meet the rigorous standards expected by military medical authorities. They established precise criteria for measuring pain levels, infection rates, healing speed, and overall recovery progress. Multiple physicians would observe and document all treatments to eliminate potential bias or subjective interpretation of results. Clara found herself at the center of a scientific process that felt alien to everything she understood about healing. Her gift had always been intuitive and personal, flowing naturally from her empathy for suffering patients. Now she was expected to apply her abilities according to predetermined schedules and protocols, treating patients she barely knew under the watchful eyes of skeptical military officials. The first week of the experiment produced results that surprised everyone involved. Patients in Group B consistently showed faster healing rates, required less pain medication, and displayed fewer signs of infection compared to their counterparts in Group A. The differences were subtle but statistically significant, providing the kind of quantifiable evidence that Colonel Blackwell had demanded. However, the experiment also revealed unexpected complications in Clara's healing abilities. Some patients in Group B showed remarkable improvement, while others experienced only marginal benefits. The inconsistency puzzled the medical observers and frustrated Clara, who had never before encountered such variable results from her touch. Captain Stone observed the experiment with detached fascination, his unique condition allowing him to analyze Clara's work without the emotional investment that affected other participants. He spent hours discussing the results with Dr. Hartwell and Colonel Blackwell, offering insights that his intellectual clarity and emotional numbness made possible. The variance in Miss Mitchell's effectiveness seems to correlate with factors beyond the severity of physical injuries, Stone observed during one of their evening discussions. Patients who trust her completely show better results than those who remain skeptical. It's as if her healing requires some form of emotional cooperation from the recipients. Stone's analysis proved remarkably accurate. Further investigation revealed that soldiers who had heard stories about Clara's abilities and believed in her healing touch responded better to treatment than those who remained doubtful or resistant. This discovery complicated the experimental results, suggesting that Clara's healing involved psychological as well as physical components. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, a military physician specializing in battlefield psychology, was brought in to evaluate the mental health aspects of Clara's work. Pierce had studied the psychological factors that influenced recovery rates and was particularly interested in understanding how belief, hope, and emotional state affected physical healing processes. What we're observing here challenges the traditional separation between mind and body in medical treatment, Pierce explained to the assembled medical staff. Miss Mitchell's healing appears to work through mechanisms that integrate psychological and physical responses in ways that conventional medicine doesn't fully understand. The psychological dimension of Clara's abilities became even more apparent when she began working with soldiers suffering from what military medicine was beginning to recognize as psychological trauma from combat. These men displayed no visible physical injuries, but were nonetheless incapacitated by nightmares, uncontrollable shaking, and an inability to function in daily activities. Private Jonathan Miller, a young soldier from Ohio who had survived a devastating artillery barrage that killed most of his unit, exemplified this type of invisible wound. He had been functioning normally until the psychological impact of his experiences overwhelmed his ability to cope. Miller couldn't sleep without nightmares, jumped at sudden sounds, and frequently broke down in tears without apparent cause. When Clara began working with Miller, something remarkable occurred. Her gentle touch seemed to calm the psychological storms that conventional medicine couldn't address. She would sit with him during his worst episodes, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders or forehead, and gradually his shaking would subside. His breathing would return to normal, and a sense of peace would settle over his features. "It's like she absorbs the fear and pain that's trapped inside me," Miller explained to Dr. Pierce. "When she touches me, I can feel the terror leaving, my body flowing out through her hands. I don't understand how it works, but I know that she's taking my suffering into herself and somehow transforming it." This psychological healing presented new challenges for the formal experiment. How could researchers measure improvements in mental states that had no visible symptoms? How could they quantify the reduction of fear, anxiety, or emotional trauma? The tools available to military medicine in 1863 were inadequate for documenting psychological healing, yet the evidence of Clara's effectiveness in this area was undeniable. Colonel Blackwell found himself grappling with questions that extended far beyond medical procedures and treatment protocols. If Clara could heal psychological wounds as well as physical injuries, what did that mean for military medicine's understanding of trauma and recovery? How should the Army utilize healing abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional medical science? The experiment took an unexpected turn when several soldiers in Group A began requesting transfer to Group B, having heard about the remarkable recoveries occurring among patients receiving Clara's attention. The requests created ethical dilemmas about denying potentially beneficial treatment to control group participants while maintaining the scientific integrity of the study. We're facing a situation where the experiment itself is becoming a source of psychological trauma for patients who believe they're being denied superior care, Dr. Hartwell observed to Colonel Blackwell. "The scientific method requires maintaining our control group, but our medical oath requires providing the best possible treatment to all patients." The dilemma was resolved through an innovative compromise. Patients in Group A would continue receiving standard medical care, but Clara would be allowed to spend time with them, providing comfort and emotional support without her characteristic healing touch. This modification allowed researchers to distinguish between the psychological benefits of Clara's presence and the specific effects of her healing abilities. Captain Stone's role in the experiment evolved beyond that of observer to active participant. When Colonel Blackwell decided to include him as a unique test case, Stone's inability to feel physical sensations or emotional responses made him an ideal subject for determining whether Clara's healing involved measurable physical changes that occurred independently of patient psychology. The sessions between Clara and Stone during the experiment period revealed new dimensions to their relationship. While Stone remained unresponsive to her healing touch in terms of sensation or emotion, careful medical monitoring detected subtle physiological changes that occurred during their interactions. His heart rate became more regular, his breathing deepened, and his brain activity showed patterns that suggested increased neural connectivity. What we're seeing in Captain Stone's case suggests that Miss Mitchell's healing produces measurable physical effects, even when the patient cannot consciously perceive them, Dr. Pierce reported to the experimental team. His body is responding to her touch at a cellular level, despite his inability to feel the sensations or emotional effects that other patients experience. These findings open new avenues of investigation into the mechanisms underlying Clara's healing abilities. If her touch could produce physiological changes in a patient who couldn't feel anything, it suggested that her healing worked through pathways that operated below the level of conscious sensation. The implications for understanding pain, healing, and the relationship between mind and body were profound. The experiment's most dramatic moment came during its 4th week, when a massive influx of casualties from the Battle of Cold Harbor overwhelmed the hospital's capacity. Wounded soldiers filled every available bed and stretched out on makeshift pallets covering the floors. The sheer number of critically injured men threatened to collapse the entire medical system. During this crisis, the artificial constraints of the controlled experiment became untenable. Clara moved freely throughout the overcrowded hospital, providing healing touch to anyone who needed it, regardless of their assigned experimental group. The emergency situation revealed her abilities operating at full capacity, unrestrained by scientific protocols or military regulations. Colonel Blackwell observed Clara working during the crisis with growing amazement and respect. She moved from patient to patient with tireless energy, her healing touch providing comfort and accelerated recovery to soldiers who might otherwise have died waiting for conventional medical attention. Her abilities seemed to amplify during the emergency, as if the desperate need around her enhanced her capacity to heal. "What I'm witnessing defies everything I thought I knew about medicine and healing," Blackwell confided to Dr. Hartwell as they watched Clara work through the night. "Whether we can explain her abilities scientifically or not, their practical value in saving lives is undeniable." The crisis also revealed new aspects of Stone's condition and its potential implications. When the hospital's security was threatened by reports of approaching Union forces, Stone volunteered for a dangerous reconnaissance mission despite his healing wounds. His inability to feel pain allowed him to move through hostile territory and gather intelligence that proved crucial for the hospital's safety. Captain Stone's condition, while medically troubling, provides tactical advantages that we cannot ignore, Colonel Blackwell observed. A soldier who cannot feel pain or fear could be invaluable in certain military operations, though the psychological costs of such emotional numbness raise serious ethical questions. As the Battle of Cold Harbor casualties were stabilized and the immediate crisis passed, the formal experiment concluded with results that satisfied no one completely while challenging everyone's preconceptions. Clara's healing abilities had been documented and measured, providing statistical evidence of their effectiveness. However, the mechanisms underlying her gifts remained mysterious, and the implications for military medicine extended far beyond simple treatment protocols. The experiment's end marked the beginning of a new phase in Clara's story as military. Authorities grappled with questions about how to utilize healing abilities that transcended conventional medical understanding. Her relationship with Stone had evolved into something unique, a partnership between two people whose conditions isolated them from normal human experience, but created possibilities for connection that neither had imagined. Colonel Blackwell's final report on the experiment would reach the highest levels of Confederate military command, setting in motion events that would transform both Clara's life and the future of military medicine. The gentle touch that had begun as an act of compassion was about to become a strategic asset in a war that consumed everything it touched, raising questions about the price of healing and the cost of hope in a world torn apart by conflict. The sealed orders that arrived with Major General Thomas Crawford's aide-de-camp changed everything. Colonel Blackwell opened the official dispatch with the routine expectation of standard military correspondence, but the contents carried implications that would reshape Clara's life and potentially alter the course of the war itself. The Confederate High Command had read his experimental reports with intense interest, and their response revealed strategic thinking that extended far beyond battlefield medicine. Miss Mitchell is to be transferred immediately to the Special Medical Operations Division in Richmond, Blackwell read aloud to Dr. Hartwell, his voice betraying the shock he felt. She will be assigned to work directly with General Lee's medical staff to develop new approaches to treating wounded officers and maintaining troop morale during extended campaigns. The orders represented recognition of Clara's abilities at the highest levels of military authority, but they also meant separating her from the field hospital where she had discovered and developed her healing gifts. Dr. Hartwell felt a profound sense of loss at the prospect of losing the young woman whose presence had transformed his medical practice and saved countless lives. More troubling were the additional orders concerning Captain Stone. His unique condition had also attracted the attention of Confederate intelligence services, who saw potential applications for a soldier who could function normally despite severe physical trauma. Stone was to be reassigned to a special reconnaissance unit that specialized in deep penetration missions behind enemy lines, where his inability to feel pain might provide crucial advantages in survival situations. Clara received the news of her transfer with the same quiet composure she brought to all challenging situations, but those who knew her well could see the distress in her eyes. The field hospital had become her home, the wounded soldiers her family, and Dr. Hartwell a father figure who had protected and nurtured her abilities. Leaving this sanctuary for the political complexities of Richmond represented a leap into unknown territory that frightened her more than she could express. Stone's reaction to his reassignment was characteristically analytical, but revealed subtle signs of the emotional connections he had developed despite his numbness. "I understand the military logic behind these decisions," he told Dr. Hartwell during their final consultation. "But I'm concerned about Miss Mitchell's welfare in Richmond. The political environment there is very different from what she's experienced here." The captain's concern reflected insights he had gained through months of observing Clara's work and character. Her healing abilities seemed to flourish in environments where she could form genuine personal connections with patients, but Richmond's medical establishment would likely view her as a curiosity to be studied rather than a healer to be respected. The bureaucratic atmosphere of the capital might stifle the empathetic qualities that made her healing possible. Dr. Hartwell spent Clara's final week at the field hospital documenting everything he had learned about her abilities, hoping to provide the Richmond physicians with information that might help them understand and utilize her gifts effectively. His notes covered not just the medical aspects of her healing, but the emotional and psychological conditions that seemed necessary for her abilities to function properly. "Clara's healing appears to require genuine emotional connection with her patients," he wrote in his comprehensive report. Her abilities are strongest when she is allowed to spend extended time with individual soldiers, developing trust and understanding that facilitates the healing process. Attempts to use her gifts in impersonal or bureaucratic contexts may significantly reduce their effectiveness. The farewell ceremonies organized by the recovered soldiers demonstrated the profound impact Clara had made on the military community. Men who had been expected to die presented her with handmade gifts crafted during their recovery. Sergeant Crawford, whose survival had first revealed Clara's healing abilities, spoke for all of them when he presented her with a wooden cross he had carved during his convalescence. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you gave us back our lives when we had given up hope. This cross represents our faith that wherever you go, you'll continue bringing healing to those who need it most. We'll never forget what you've done for us." The emotional weight of these farewells affected Clara more deeply than anyone realized. Her healing abilities had always been powered by her empathy for suffering, but the bonds she had formed with individual patients had also nourished her own emotional well-being. Leaving these relationships behind felt like tearing away part of herself. Stone's departure preparations revealed the complex logistics involved in utilizing a soldier who couldn't feel physical sensations. His new unit required detailed medical protocols for monitoring his health, since he couldn't rely on pain to alert him to injuries or illnesses. Special equipment had to be developed to help him detect wounds that might otherwise go unnoticed until they became life-threatening. Captain William Foster, Stone's new commanding officer, arrived to escort him to his specialized unit with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Foster had read Stone's medical files, but had never encountered a soldier with such unusual capabilities and limitations. The briefing sessions they conducted revealed both the tactical advantages and serious risks involved in deploying someone with Stone's condition. "Your inability to feel pain could allow you to continue functioning in situations that would incapacitate normal soldiers," Foster explained during their strategy discussions. "However, you'll need constant medical monitoring to ensure that you don't sustain injuries that could prove fatal if left undetected. This mission requires careful balance between utilizing your advantages and managing your vulnerabilities." The night before their departures, Clara and Stone spent several hours together in the quiet of the hospital's recovery ward. Their conversation, conducted largely through Clara's expressive gestures and Stone's analytical observations, covered the uncertain futures they both faced and the unique connection they had developed despite their respective isolations. "I've been thinking about what happens to people like us," Stone said, his voice carrying a thoughtfulness that had become more pronounced during his recovery. "We're both outsiders to normal human experience. You because you cannot speak, me because I cannot feel. Perhaps that's why we understand each other in ways that others cannot." Clara nodded, placing her hand gently on Stone's arm in a gesture that had become their characteristic form of communication. Despite his inability to feel her touch physically, something in her presence seemed to reach through his emotional numbness to create a connection that transcended normal sensory experience. Their farewell was unlike any emotional goodbye Clara had ever experienced or witnessed. Stone could not feel the sadness that such partings normally involved, but his intellectual understanding of loss created a form of grief that was perhaps more profound because it existed purely in his thoughts rather than his emotions. Clara, whose muteness prevented her from expressing her feelings verbally, found herself facing the departure of the one person who truly understood her isolation. "I want you to know something," Stone said as they prepared to separate, perhaps forever. "Your presence has given me something I thought I had lost permanently. Not sensation or emotion, but a sense of connection to another human being. Whatever they ask you to do in Richmond. Remember that your greatest gift isn't your healing touch. It's your capacity to see people as individuals deserving of compassion. Clara's final night at the field hospital was spent making rounds among the patients who would remain behind. Each soldier she visited understood that this might be their last opportunity to experience her healing presence, and their gratitude created an atmosphere of reverence that affected everyone in the facility. Dr. Hartwell found Clara sitting beside the bed of Private Miller, the young soldier whose psychological trauma she had helped heal. Miller was scheduled to return to his unit within days, his mental wounds sufficiently healed to allow him to resume military service. Clara's hand rested on his forehead as he slept peacefully, free from the nightmares that had once consumed him. "You've given him back his sanity," Dr. Hartwell observed quietly. "When he arrived here, I thought he would need to be discharged from service as mentally unfit. Now he's ready to return to his duties with full confidence in his abilities." That kind of healing goes beyond medicine. The morning of departure brought military efficiency that left little time for extended farewells. Clara's belongings, few as they were packed into a supply wagon, while Stone's gear was loaded onto a fast courier carriage that would take him to his new assignment. The bureaucratic nature of their departures seemed to minimize the profound changes that were occurring in all their lives. As Clara climbed into the wagon that would carry her to Richmond, she looked back at the field hospital that had been her home for 8 months. The building looked smaller than she remembered, almost insignificant compared to the life-changing experiences it had contained. But she knew that her time there had prepared her for whatever challenges awaited in the Confederate capital. Stone's departure was more formal, involving salutes and military protocols that acknowledged his new status as a specialized operative. His farewell to Dr. Hartwell was brief but meaningful, representing gratitude for medical care that had saved his life, even if it couldn't restore his ability to feel. The roads leading away from the field hospital carried Clara and Stone in different directions, toward futures that would test their abilities in ways neither had imagined. Clara's journey to Richmond would introduce her to political complexities and military priorities that had little in common with the straightforward medical needs she had served. Stone's assignment to special reconnaissance operations would challenge his capacity to function as a soldier despite his emotional and physical numbness. But both carried with them lessons learned through their time together. Clara understanding that healing required not just compassion, but wisdom about when and how to apply her gifts. Stone recognizing that his condition, while isolating, could serve purposes larger than his individual survival. The field hospital continued its work without them, but the innovations they had inspired during their time there had created permanent changes in how the facility approached patient care. Dr. Hartwell's reports on their contributions would influence military medicine throughout the Confederacy, establishing precedents for recognizing and utilizing unconventional healing methods. As the wagon carrying Clara disappeared over a distant hill, heading toward Richmond and an uncertain future, the story that had begun with a mute girl's gentle touch was entering a new phase that would test whether her healing abilities could survive the harsh realities of war's political dimensions. Richmond's bustling streets overwhelmed Clara with sensory chaos she had never experienced. The Confederate capital hummed with urgent activity. Politicians hurrying between government buildings, military officers coordinating supply chains, merchants hawking goods to desperate civilians, and everywhere the underlying tension of a city under siege. After months in the quiet countryside hospital, the urban cacophony felt like assault on her sensitive nature. The Confederate medical headquarters occupied a grand mansion on Clay Street that had been requisitioned from a wealthy tobacco merchant. Early in the war, Its elegant rooms, once designed for social gatherings and family life, had been converted into military offices where life and death decisions were made with bureaucratic efficiency. Clara's arrival was processed with the same impersonal formality applied to medical supplies and equipment requisitions. Dr. Cornelius Waverley, the chief medical administrator for the Confederate States Army, greeted Clara with polite skepticism that barely concealed his irritation at having his time consumed by what he considered folklore masquerading as military priority. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College and veteran of the Mexican-American War, Waverley represented the medical establishment's resistance to anything that couldn't be quantified, categorized, and controlled through established procedures. "Miss Mitchell," Dr. Waverley said during their initial meeting, his tone suggesting he was humoring the whims of superior officers, "I've read the reports about your alleged healing abilities, though I must say they sound more like desperate battlefield mythology than scientific observation. Nevertheless, orders from General Lee's staff require that we evaluate your potential contributions to our medical operations." The clinical coldness of Waverley's approach immediately made Clara uncomfortable. Unlike Dr. Hartwell, who had approached her abilities with scientific curiosity tempered by genuine care for patient welfare, Waverley seemed interested only in documenting her methods for potential military applications. His questions focused on efficiency metrics and scalability rather than the human connections that made her healing possible. Clara's first assignment involved working with wounded officers in the military hospital wing of the medical headquarters. These were men of rank and social standing whose recovery was considered strategically important to Confederate command structure. Many had been evacuated from frontline positions specifically to receive the best available medical care that Richmond could provide. The sterile efficiency of the Richmond facility stood in stark contrast to the field hospital where Clara had developed her healing abilities. Everything operated according to rigid schedules and military protocols that left little room for the personal relationships she needed to establish with patients. Nurses moved through their duties with professional detachment, doctors made brief examinations focused on immediate medical concerns, and visitors were strictly limited to prevent disruption of hospital operations. Clara's first patient was Colonel Jefferson Davis III, nephew of the Confederate president, who had suffered severe burns during an ammunition depot explosion. The political implications of his case added pressure that transformed medical treatment into a test of Confederate medical capabilities. Dr. Waverley assigned Clara to work with the colonel under close supervision, viewing it as an opportunity to evaluate her abilities in a high-stakes situation. However, Clara's initial attempts to heal Colonel Davis met with frustration that surprised everyone involved. Her touch, which had consistently brought relief and accelerated healing to field hospital patients, seemed to have no effect on the colonel's burns. Hours of gentle contact produced no visible improvements, leaving Clara confused and Dr. Waverley smugly vindicated in his skepticism about her abilities. "As I suspected," Waverley observed after several unsuccessful sessions, "Miss Mitchell's alleged healing powers appear to be nothing more than coincidental improvements that occurred alongside conventional medical treatment. Under controlled conditions with proper medical supervision, her methods prove completely ineffective." But Clara sensed that the problem wasn't with her abilities, but with the environment and circumstances surrounding her work. Colonel Davis, while polite and cooperative, treated her presence as a medical procedure to be endured rather than a source of genuine healing. The formal atmosphere of the Richmond hospital prevented the personal connections that seemed essential for her gifts to function properly. The breakthrough came when Clara encountered Private Timothy Walsh, an enlisted man who had been assigned to janitorial duties in the officers' ward despite suffering from partially healed shrapnel wounds that caused him constant pain. Walsh worked quietly in the background, emptying wastebaskets and mopping floors while trying to hide the discomfort that made every movement difficult. Unlike the officers who received Clara's attention as part of their prescribed treatment, Walsh initially tried to avoid her, believing that someone of her apparent importance shouldn't be bothered with a common soldier's problems. But Clara's empathetic nature drew her to his obvious suffering, and she began spending time with him during quiet moments when her official duties were complete. The informal nature of their interaction allowed Clara to establish the kind of personal connection that her healing required. Walsh shared stories about his family farm in Tennessee, his fears about the war's outcome, and his gratitude for any relief from the constant pain that medications couldn't adequately address. Clara listened with the same compassionate attention she had given to field hospital patients, and gradually her healing touch began to work its familiar magic. Within days, Walsh's wounds showed remarkable improvement. The persistent infection that had resisted conventional treatment cleared completely, and the range of motion in his injured arm returned to nearly normal levels. More significantly, his overall demeanor changed from quiet resignation to genuine hope and energy that affected everyone around him. Word of Walsh's recovery reached Dr. Waverley through the hospital's informal communication network, creating new questions about Clara's abilities and their apparent dependence on factors that medical science didn't recognize or understand. The stark contrast between her failure with Colonel Davis and her success with Private Walsh challenged assumptions about healing that extended beyond Clara's specific gifts. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few female physicians working in Confederate medical services, observed Clara's work with Walsh and offered insights that the male medical establishment had overlooked. Dr. Sinclair had fought for recognition in a profession that questioned women's capabilities, giving her perspective on the importance of emotional factors in healing that her male colleagues often dismissed. Miss Mitchell's healing appears to require authentic human connection rather than clinical detachment, Dr. Sinclair explained to Dr. Waverley during a staff meeting. Her success with Private Walsh suggests that her abilities function best when she can relate to patients as individuals rather than medical cases. The formal atmosphere we maintain with officers may actually inhibit the personal relationships her healing requires. Dr. Sinclair's analysis opened new avenues for understanding Clara's gifts that had implications extending far beyond individual patient care. If healing truly required emotional connection and mutual trust, it challenged medical practices that emphasized professional distance and clinical objectivity. The implications for military medicine, which prioritized efficiency and hierarchy over personal relationships, were profound. Meanwhile, reports began filtering back to Richmond about Captain Stone's activities with his specialized reconnaissance unit. His first mission behind Union lines had been a remarkable success, with Stone gathering intelligence about Federal troop movements despite sustaining injuries that would have incapacitated any normal soldier. His inability to feel pain had allowed him to continue functioning after being shot in the leg, providing crucial information about Union artillery positions. However, Stone's condition also created new challenges that his commanding officers hadn't fully anticipated. During one mission, he had suffered a severe infection from an untreated wound that he hadn't realized was serious until he collapsed from fever and blood poisoning. His emotional numbness made it difficult for him to recognize when he needed medical attention, creating situations where his tactical advantages became life-threatening liabilities. Captain Foster's reports to Richmond described Stone as an invaluable asset whose unique capabilities required constant medical oversight to prevent him from inadvertently causing his own death. The paradox of a soldier who could function despite pain but couldn't protect himself from the consequences of unrecognized injuries presented strategic dilemmas that Confederate command hadn't considered. Back in Richmond, Clara's work gradually expanded beyond the officer's ward as Dr. Sinclair advocated for utilizing her abilities in ways that honored their apparent requirements for personal connection. She began spending time in the general patient wards, where wounded enlisted men responded to her presence with the same gratitude and trust she had experienced at the field hospital. The contrast between Clara's effectiveness with common soldiers and her struggles with high-ranking officers became a source of institutional embarrassment that reflected broader questions about Confederate social hierarchy and military priorities. The implication that healing might work better among the lower classes than the aristocracy challenged assumptions about Confederate society that extended far beyond medical practice. Dr. Waverley found himself in the uncomfortable position of documenting results that contradicted his scientific skepticism while supporting political conclusions that made Confederate leadership uncomfortable. Clara's healing abilities were real and valuable, but they seemed to function according to principles that challenged both medical orthodoxy and social conventions. The situation reached a crisis point when General Robert E. Lee himself requested a private consultation with Clara about persistent pain from old injuries that conventional medicine hadn't been able to address. The prospect of applying unconventional healing methods to the Confederacy's most important military leader created political tensions that transcended medical considerations. Clara's session with General Lee took place in private quarters that allowed for the informal atmosphere her healing seemed to require. Unlike other high-ranking officers, Lee approached the consultation with genuine openness and personal humility that created space for the authentic connection Clara needed. His willingness to relate to her as a fellow human being rather than a medical curiosity allowed her abilities to function properly. The results were dramatic enough to convince even Dr. Waverley that Clara's healing abilities were genuine and potentially valuable to Confederate military operations. General Lee's chronic pain subsided significantly, and his energy levels improved noticeably in the days following their session. More importantly, Lee's personal endorsement of Clara's abilities legitimized her work in ways that no amount of statistical documentation could have achieved, but success in Richmond's political environment brought new challenges that threatened to transform Clara from a healer into a political asset whose abilities might be exploited for purposes that had little to do with genuine medical care. The bureaucratic machinery of Confederate government began developing plans for utilizing her gifts that prioritized strategic advantage over the human compassion that made her healing possible. As Clara navigated the complex political currents of Richmond, she found herself longing for the simple clarity of purpose she had experienced at the field hospital. The wounded soldiers there had needed her healing, and she had been able to provide it without concern for political implications or strategic calculations. In the capital, every healing session carried consequences that extended far beyond individual, patient welfare. Unknown to Clara, events were transpiring that would soon reunite her with Captain Stone under circumstances that would test both of their abilities in ways they had never imagined. The war was entering a new phase that would require every resource the Confederacy could muster, including the unique gifts of a mute girl who could heal with her touch, and a soldier who could function despite feeling nothing at all. The emergency summons that arrived at Confederate medical headquarters came through multiple channels simultaneously: telegraph, courier, and military dispatch, indicating a crisis of unprecedented urgency. General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had suffered catastrophic casualties during the Battle of the Wilderness, with thousands of wounded soldiers trapped behind Union lines in territory that conventional rescue operations couldn't reach. The situation demanded resources and capabilities that pushed beyond everything the Confederacy had previously attempted. Clara found herself called into an emergency strategy session that included General Lee's Chief of Staff, intelligence officers, and senior medical personnel. The gravity of the situation was evident in the faces around the conference table. These were men accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, but the scope of this crisis challenged even their hardened military sensibilities. Colonel Robert Harrison, Lee's chief intelligence officer, outlined the situation with clinical precision that couldn't mask the desperation underlying their circumstances. "We have approximately 800 wounded soldiers scattered across a 15-mile stretch of wilderness that's now under Union control. Conventional medical evacuation is impossible due to enemy positions and the difficult terrain. Most of these men will die within days without immediate medical intervention." The strategic problem was compounded by intelligence reports indicating that Captain Stone's reconnaissance unit had been operating in the same area when the battle erupted. Stone himself was missing in action, last seen leading a mission to gather information about Union supply lines before the massive engagement began. His fate remained unknown, but his specialized capabilities made him too valuable to abandon without exhaustive rescue efforts. Dr. Waverley's initial response reflected the bureaucratic thinking that had characterized Confederate medical administration. This situation, while tragic, doesn't change our fundamental strategic priorities. We cannot risk valuable medical resources on operations that have minimal probability of success. Miss Mitchell's abilities, while useful in controlled circumstances, cannot address casualties on this scale. But General Lee's personal intervention transformed the discussion from bureaucratic assessment to desperate innovation. The Confederate commander had experienced Clara's healing abilities firsthand and understood their potential value in situations where conventional medicine had no solutions. More importantly, he grasped the strategic implications of losing 800 experienced soldiers who might be saved through unconventional methods. "Dr. Waverley," Lee said with quiet authority that brooked no debate, "we will attempt this rescue operation using every resource at our disposal. Miss Mitchell's healing abilities represent our best hope for keeping wounded soldiers alive during evacuation from hostile territory. Captain Stone's knowledge of the terrain and his unique capabilities make him essential for guiding rescue teams through Union-controlled areas." The mission plan that emerged from the emergency session was unlike anything attempted during the war. A small team of experienced scouts would infiltrate Union lines to locate and stabilize wounded Confederate soldiers, with Clara providing healing support that might keep critically injured men alive during the dangerous journey back to Confederate territory. If Stone could be found alive, his reconnaissance skills and pain immunity would make him invaluable for navigating the treacherous wilderness. Clara received the mission briefing with the same quiet composure she brought to all challenges. But the magnitude of what was being asked of her was unlike anything she had previously faced. Instead of working with individual patients in controlled medical environments, she would be applying her healing abilities under combat conditions while moving through hostile territory filled with dangers that could kill her as easily as the soldiers she was trying to save. Dr. Margaret Sinclair volunteered to accompany the mission as Clara's medical support, understanding that Clara's healing abilities would need conventional medical backup to be effective in such extreme circumstances. Together, they began preparing emergency medical supplies and developing protocols for applying Clara's healing touch to multiple patients under battlefield conditions. The rescue team assembled for the mission represented the Confederacy's most experienced wilderness fighters and medical personnel. Captain James Bradford, a veteran scout from the Virginia mountains, would lead the team through Union lines using routes that his knowledge of local geography made possible. Sergeant William Hayes, a former frontier doctor turned combat medic, would provide conventional medical support for wounded soldiers who needed immediate treatment before Clara's healing could take effect. The night before departure, Clara found herself struggling with doubts about her ability to succeed in such an extreme situation. Her healing had always been most effective in quiet, personal settings, where she could establish emotional connections with individual patients. The chaos of battlefield conditions and the need to treat multiple wounded soldiers simultaneously represented challenges that might overwhelm her abilities entirely. Dr. Sinclair recognized Clara's anxiety and provided encouragement that addressed both the practical and emotional aspects of the mission. "Your healing doesn't depend on perfect conditions," she explained during their final preparation session. "It emerges from your compassion for suffering, and there will be more genuine suffering in that wilderness than you've ever encountered. Trust in your gift and remember that even small improvements in each soldier's condition could mean the difference between life and death during evacuation." The mission departed Richmond before dawn, traveling in small groups through back roads and forest paths that avoided Union patrols and civilian areas where their presence might be reported to federal authorities. Clara rode in a supply wagon disguised as medical equipment, while the combat members of the team moved on horseback with weapons and equipment needed for operating behind enemy lines. The journey toward the wilderness battlefield took 2 days of careful movement through contested territory, where both armies maintained irregular forces that could appear without warning. Clara experienced her first direct exposure to active combat zones when Union cavalry scouts discovered their group near the Rapidan River, forcing a running firefight that lasted several hours before they could escape into dense forest. During the firefight, Clara witnessed the kind of violence that had previously existed only as distant reports and the wounded soldiers who arrived at medical facilities. The immediate reality of men trying to kill each other with systematic efficiency shocked her in ways that months of treating wounded soldiers hadn't prepared her for. The abstract concept of war became terrifyingly concrete as bullets whistled past her hiding place and explosions shook the ground beneath her feet, but the combat also revealed new dimensions of her healing abilities that surprised everyone involved. When Sergeant Hayes suffered a severe leg wound during the engagement, Clara's healing touch provided immediate pain relief and accelerated clotting that stopped potentially fatal bleeding. Under extreme stress, her abilities seemed to intensify rather than diminish, as if the desperate need around her amplified her capacity to heal. The team reached the edge of the wilderness battlefield on their 3rd day, confronting a scene of devastation that exceeded their worst expectations. The fighting had transformed a peaceful forest into a hellscape of broken trees, cratered earth, and scattered equipment from both armies. Smoke still rose from numerous fires, and the stench of death hung heavy in the humid air. Most troubling was the evidence of wounded soldiers scattered throughout the area. Moans and calls for help echoed through the forest from men who had been lying injured for days without medical attention. Union forces controlled the main roads and clearings, but wounded Confederate soldiers remained hidden in thick underbrush and ravines where enemy patrols hadn't found them. Captain Bradford's reconnaissance revealed the location of a Confederate field aid station that had been overrun during the battle, but still contained medical supplies and several wounded soldiers who had been too injured to retreat. The position offered a defensible location where Clara could work on stabilizing patients before attempting to move them back toward Confederate lines. The approach to the aid station required navigating through areas where Union pickets maintained irregular surveillance. Bradford's knowledge of woodland tactics and the team's small size allowed them to move undetected through terrain that larger rescue operations couldn't have penetrated. But the constant threat of discovery created tension that affected everyone's ability to function normally. Clara's first sight of the wounded soldiers at the abandoned aid station challenged her emotional capacity to process human suffering. Men who had been lying untreated for days displayed injuries that conventional medicine couldn't address, and wounds that had become infected beyond normal healing. Some were delirious with fever, others had lost consciousness from blood loss, and several appeared to be dying from complications that proper medical care might have prevented. The scale of suffering overwhelmed Clara's usual approach to healing, individual patients through personal connection. Instead, she had to develop new methods for applying her abilities to multiple patients simultaneously while maintaining the emotional focus that made her healing possible. She began moving from soldier to soldier in systematic patterns, providing brief healing touches that stabilized their conditions enough to allow for evacuation. The breakthrough in her technique came when she realized that the wounded soldiers' shared experience of abandonment and desperation created a collective emotional state that her healing could address. Instead of trying to establish individual relationships with each patient, she began drawing on the common bonds of suffering that connected all the wounded men, using their shared experience as a foundation for healing that transcended individual personalities. The results exceeded anything she had previously achieved. Soldiers who had been dying from infected wounds began showing signs of improvement within hours. Men who had been delirious with fever regained consciousness and coherent thought. Most dramatically, patients who had lost hope of survival began displaying the kind of determination and fighting spirit that would be essential for the dangerous journey back to Confederate territory. But the mission's most significant discovery came when they found Captain Stone, barely alive and trapped beneath fallen timber in a ravine where he had taken shelter after being wounded during the initial battle. His condition presented unique challenges because his inability to feel pain had prevented him from recognizing the severity of his injuries, allowing infections and complications to develop that might have killed him if left untreated much longer. Stone's reunion with Clara under such desperate circumstances revealed the depth of the connection they had developed despite their respective isolations. His relief at seeing her alive transcended his usual emotional numbness, while her concern for his welfare motivated her to apply her healing abilities with an intensity she had never before experienced. "I knew you would come," Stone said, as Clara began working to heal his multiple injuries, his voice carrying an emotional warmth that surprised both of them. "Not because of military orders or strategic necessity, but because you understand what it means to be lost and alone. That understanding is what makes your healing possible." Clara's response came through the gentle intensity of her touch, as she worked to repair damage that conventional medicine couldn't have addressed. Stone's wounds began healing at accelerated rates that amazed even Dr. Sinclair, demonstrating that Clara's abilities reached peak effectiveness when applied to people with whom she shared genuine emotional bonds. The successful stabilization of Stone and the other wounded soldiers marked the beginning of the mission's most dangerous phase, evacuating critically injured men through hostile territory while avoiding Union patrols that could capture or kill them all. But Clara's healing had given them something that military planning couldn't provide: hope that survival was possible even in impossible circumstances. The evacuation began at midnight under a moonless sky that provided cover, but made navigation treacherous through the battle-scarred wilderness. Clara found herself at the center of an operation unlike anything attempted during the war, moving 43 critically wounded soldiers through 15 miles of Union-controlled territory while maintaining their medical stability through a healing touch and conventional treatment. Captain Bradford had divided the wounded into groups of 7, with each group accompanied by 2 scouts who knew the terrain and escape routes back to Confederate lines. Clara would move between groups throughout the night, providing healing support to soldiers whose conditions deteriorated during the difficult journey. Stone, despite his own injuries, insisted on serving as point scout for the most dangerous route, using his inability to feel pain as an advantage in terrain that would disable normal soldiers. The first challenge came within an hour of departure, when Private Daniel Murphy, a young soldier from Georgia whose chest wound had partially reopened during transport, began showing signs of internal bleeding that threatened his life. Clara had to work on him while the group sheltered in a dense thicket, her healing touch providing the only thing standing between Murphy and death while Union patrols moved along nearby roads. Dr. Sinclair monitored Murphy's vital signs while Clara worked, whispering medical observations that helped guide her healing efforts. "His pulse is stabilizing," she reported quietly. "Whatever you're doing is stopping the internal bleeding and improving his cardiovascular function. But we need to keep moving. Staying in one place too long increases our risk of discovery." The night became a series of similar crises as the physical stress of evacuation pushed wounded soldiers beyond their capacity to survive without constant medical intervention. Clara developed a system of rotating between groups, spending 15 to 20 minutes with each set of patients before moving to the next, maintaining healing contact that kept critically injured men alive during the most dangerous journey of their lives. Stone's reconnaissance reports revealed the complexity of their situation. Union forces had established patrol patterns that covered most direct routes back to Confederate territory, forcing the evacuation groups to follow longer, more difficult paths through swampland and dense forest that exhausted both the wounded soldiers and their escorts. Worse, Federal cavalry units were actively searching for Confederate survivors, having received intelligence about possible rescue operations. "We have 3 Union patrol routes converging on our position," Stone reported during a brief rest stop, where several groups had gathered to allow Clara to work on the most seriously wounded soldiers. "The southern route is our best option, but it requires crossing open ground where we'll be visible if anyone is watching. The alternative routes add 6 hours to our journey through terrain that will kill some of these men." The tactical decision fell to Captain Bradford, whose wilderness experience provided the best assessment of their options. But the choice ultimately depended on Clara's evaluation of which wounded soldiers could survive extended travel versus those who needed immediate evacuation despite the increased risk of discovery. Clara moved among the wounded soldiers, using her healing touch to assess their conditions and prognosis for survival during different evacuation scenarios. Her abilities had evolved during the mission to include a form of diagnostic sensitivity that allowed her to sense which patients had the best chances of surviving various routes back to safety. Corporal Benjamin Wright, whose leg wound had become severely infected, clearly needed immediate medical attention that only Confederate field hospitals could provide. Private Thomas Anderson, suffering from multiple shrapnel wounds, had stabilized enough under Clara's care to survive the longer but safer route. These individual assessments would determine how the groups were divided and which routes they would attempt. The most heartbreaking decisions involved soldiers whose wounds were too severe for evacuation under any circumstances. 3 men, whose conditions had deteriorated beyond Clara's ability to stabilize, would have to be left behind with minimal medical supplies and hopes that they might be found by Union forces who would provide medical care rather than treating them as prisoners to be ignored. Clara's farewell to these abandoned soldiers represented one of the most difficult moments of her young life. She spent precious time providing what healing comfort she could, knowing that her touch might be the last human kindness they would experience. The soldiers understood their situation and faced abandonment with courage that honored their service while breaking Clara's heart. "Miss Clara," whispered Lieutenant Samuel Davis, one of the soldiers being left behind, "tell folks back home that we died fighting for something that mattered. And remember that your healing gave us hope even when there was no hope left. That's a gift more valuable than staying alive." The main evacuation resumed, with 37 soldiers divided into 5 groups, following different routes toward Confederate lines. Clara accompanied the group containing the most critically wounded patients, knowing that her healing abilities would be most needed where conventional medicine had the least chance of success. Stone led the most dangerous group along a route that required crossing Union supply lines, but offered the fastest path to safety for soldiers who couldn't survive extended travel. His reconnaissance skills and immunity to pain made him ideally suited for navigating terrain that would challenge even experienced scouts, while his emotional connection to Clara motivated him to succeed despite the personal risks involved. The night's most terrifying moment came when Clara's group encountered a Union patrol while crossing a creek that marked the halfway point of their journey. The wounded soldiers lay motionless in the tall grass, while Federal cavalry searched the area, apparently following reports of Confederate movement in the region. Clara found herself crouched beside Private Jonathan Mills, whose severe abdominal wound required constant healing attention to prevent internal bleeding. Any sound from Mills could reveal their position to the Union patrol, but movement away from Clara's healing touch might cause fatal hemorrhaging. She maintained contact with Mills while listening to Union soldiers search the area around their hiding place. The patrol passed within 20 yards of their position, close enough that Clara could hear individual conversations about the search pattern and orders to capture rather than kill any Confederate survivors they discovered. The proximity of enemy soldiers while she worked to keep Mills alive created tension that tested her ability to maintain the emotional focus her healing required. Dr. Sinclair's presence proved invaluable during the encounter, providing conventional medical support that allowed Clara to concentrate on healing while monitoring Mills's condition and watching for signs that other wounded soldiers might need attention. The combination of Clara's healing abilities and Dr. Sinclair's medical expertise created a partnership that maximized their chances of keeping everyone alive during the crisis. The patrol's departure allowed the evacuation to continue, but the close encounter revealed how vulnerable they remained throughout their journey. Union forces were actively hunting for Confederate survivors, and discovery would mean capture or death for everyone involved in the rescue mission. Stone's group faced even greater challenges on their more direct but dangerous route. His reconnaissance had identified a Union artillery position that commanded the main road they needed to cross, requiring a detour through a ravine where wounded soldiers would have to be carried over terrain that tested everyone's endurance. Stone's unique capabilities proved essential during this phase of the evacuation. His inability to feel pain allowed him to carry wounded soldiers over obstacles that would have injured normal men, while his tactical knowledge enabled him to identify safe routes through terrain that appeared impassable. But his emotional numbness also created communication challenges when wounded soldiers needed reassurance that he couldn't provide. The solution came through Stone's growing understanding of Clara's healing methods and the emotional connections they required. Although he couldn't feel the emotions himself, he had observed how Clara created hope and comfort in desperate situations. He began applying those lessons to his interactions with wounded soldiers, providing intellectual understanding and practical support even when he couldn't offer emotional warmth. "I can't feel what you're feeling," Stone told Private William Foster during a particularly difficult stream crossing, "but I understand that you're afraid and in pain. What I can tell you is that Miss Clara's healing has given you strength you didn't know you had, and that strength will carry you through this if you trust it." Stone's analytical approach to providing comfort proved surprisingly effective with soldiers who needed practical reassurance more than emotional support. His honesty about his limitations, combined with his obvious competence and determination, created a form of leadership that inspired confidence even without conventional emotional connection. The dawn approach brought new dangers, as daylight would make concealment impossible while still leaving several miles between the evacuation groups and Confederate lines. Clara's healing abilities had kept the wounded soldiers alive through the night, but exhaustion was affecting everyone's capacity to continue the difficult journey. The final phase of the evacuation would require crossing open farmland where Union observation posts could spot movement from miles away. Success would depend on timing, coordination between the scattered groups, and Clara's ability to maintain healing support for soldiers whose conditions continued to deteriorate despite her best efforts. But the most critical element would be Stone's reconnaissance mission to identify Union positions and safe crossing points for the final approach to Confederate territory. His willingness to expose himself to enemy fire while scouting routes for the wounded soldiers would determine whether the rescue mission succeeded or ended in capture and death for everyone involved. As the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, Clara looked at the wounded soldiers she had kept alive through the night and realized that the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. The healing that had sustained them through darkness would soon be tested by daylight exposure and the final desperate sprint toward safety. The Confederate picket line appeared through the morning mist like a mirage of salvation, its familiar, grey uniforms and battle flags marking the boundary between enemy territory and safety. But the final quarter-mile crossing through open farmland would prove the most dangerous part of their entire journey, as Union artillery positions commanded clear fields of fire over the approaches to Confederate lines. Stone's final reconnaissance mission had revealed the tactical nightmare they faced. Federal forces had positioned sharpshooters and artillery observers in a farmhouse that overlooked the only feasible crossing point. Any movement across the open ground would be spotted immediately, triggering concentrated fire that would destroy the evacuation groups before they could reach safety. Clara found herself facing a decision that would define not just the success of their mission, but her understanding of what her healing gift truly meant. The wounded soldiers they had kept alive through the night-long evacuation were now within sight of safety, but reaching it required someone to draw enemy fire away from the crossing point, a diversion that would almost certainly mean death for whoever attempted it. The only way to get everyone across is if someone creates a distraction, Captain Bradford explained during their final strategy meeting. Union forces will concentrate their fire on any obvious target, giving the wounded soldiers a chance to reach our lines during the confusion. Stone volunteered immediately, his tactical analysis cutting through emotional considerations to focus on practical necessity. His inability to feel pain made him the logical choice for a mission that would involve absorbing enemy fire while drawing attention away from the evacuation groups. But Clara's response challenged everyone's assumptions about sacrifice, duty, and the true nature of courage. She stood slowly and placed her hand on Stone's chest, then pointed toward herself with a gesture that needed no translation. Clara was volunteering to serve as the decoy, offering to sacrifice herself so that the wounded soldiers she had healed could reach safety. Dr. Sinclair immediately protested the proposal. "Clara, your healing abilities make you too valuable to risk in a diversion mission. These soldiers need you alive to continue providing medical care after we reach Confederate lines." But Clara's decision reflected insights into her gift that none of them had fully understood. Through the night-long evacuation, she had discovered that her healing worked most powerfully when motivated by complete selflessness, when she was willing to give everything for the welfare of others. The wounded soldiers had survived not just because of her healing touch, but because of her absolute commitment to their welfare above her own safety. Stone's response revealed the emotional growth he had experienced despite his neurological numbness. Clara's healing has always been about taking others' suffering into herself, he said, his voice carrying new understanding. But what she's proposing isn't healing, it's sacrifice. There's a difference between absorbing pain to transform it and accepting destruction to prevent it. The debate that followed forced everyone to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between healing and sacrifice, courage and wisdom, individual value and collective welfare. Clara's offer to serve as a decoy target represented the ultimate expression of her healing gift, but it also threatened to destroy the source of healing that had saved so many lives. The solution emerged through Clara's own intervention in the discussion. Using gestures and expressions that had become her eloquent form of communication, she conveyed a plan that utilized both her healing abilities and Stone's tactical capabilities in ways that maximized their chances of success while minimizing the risk of losing either of them. Clara would accompany Stone on the diversion mission, using her healing touch to keep him functional despite injuries he might sustain while drawing enemy fire. Stone's immunity to pain, combined with Clara's healing abilities, would create a partnership capable of surviving concentrated enemy fire long enough to allow the wounded soldiers to cross safely. Captain Bradford recognized the tactical brilliance of the plan while acknowledging its enormous risks. If this works, it will be because you're both willing to trust each other completely under the worst possible circumstances. Miss Clara's healing and Captain Stone's tactical abilities complement each other in ways that might just be enough. The final approach began with Clara and Stone moving openly across the farmland toward the Union positions, deliberately exposing themselves to enemy observation, while the evacuation groups prepared to make their crossing during the confusion that would follow. Clara's healing touch rested on Stone's arm as they walked, providing healing energy that would sustain him through whatever injuries he might suffer. The Union response was immediate and devastating. Artillery fire erupted from the farmhouse position, followed by rifle fire from multiple concealed positions that had been watching the approaches to Confederate lines. Stone absorbed multiple hits that would have killed any normal soldier, while Clara's healing touch prevented shock and blood loss that would have incapacitated him. But the true test of their partnership came when Clara herself was struck by shrapnel from an artillery burst that exploded near their position. For the first time since discovering her healing abilities, she found herself needing the kind of medical attention she had always provided to others. Stone's response transcended his emotional numbness in ways that surprised both of them. Despite his inability to feel physical sensations, he recognized Clara's injury immediately and began applying basic medical care with competence that his months of observation in field hospitals had taught him. More importantly, his concern for her welfare motivated him to continue the diversion mission, despite wounds that would have stopped any normal soldier. "Clara, stay with me," Stone said, his voice carrying emotional warmth that his condition had never previously allowed. "Your healing brought me back from numbness once before. Now I need you to let me help keep you alive while we finish what we started." The evacuation groups used the distraction to make their crossing, with wounded soldiers who had been kept alive by Clara's healing during the night, finally reaching Confederate lines and safety. Dr. Sinclair coordinated the medical reception, ensuring that conventional treatment would continue the healing process that Clara had begun, But the most remarkable development occurred as Clara and Stone supported each other during their own retreat toward Confederate lines. Stone's concern for Clara's welfare seemed to reawaken emotional responses that his injury had suppressed, while Clara's trust in Stone's protection allowed her to experience vulnerability she had never before acknowledged. "I can feel something," Stone said as they reached Confederate picket lines, his voice filled with wonder. Not physical sensation, but something else, connection, concern, maybe even... He paused, searching for words to describe experiences his condition had denied him. Maybe even caring about someone more than tactical objectives. Clara's response came through the gentle pressure of her hand in his, a touch that conveyed gratitude, affection, and recognition of the emotional breakthrough he was experiencing. Her healing abilities seemed to be working on Stone in ways that transcended physical wounds, addressing the neurological damage that had isolated him from emotional experience. The medical evaluation that followed their return revealed remarkable changes in both Clara and Stone that challenged medical understanding while validating the power of human connection under extreme circumstances. Stone's brain scans showed increased neural activity in areas associated with emotional processing, suggesting that Clara's healing touch, combined with intense emotional stress, had stimulated recovery in damaged neural pathways. Clara's own injuries healed with unprecedented speed, but more significantly, her healing abilities showed new dimensions that incorporated lessons learned during the evacuation mission. She could now work with multiple patients simultaneously while maintaining the personal connections that made her healing effective, expanding her capacity to serve in large-scale medical emergencies. General Lee's personal debriefing of the mission. Participants revealed the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The successful evacuation of 37 wounded soldiers from behind enemy lines demonstrated tactical capabilities that could be applied to other desperate situations, while Clara and Stone's partnership provided a model for utilizing unconventional abilities in military contexts. What you've achieved together transcends military tactics or medical procedures, Lee told Clara and Stone during their final meeting. You've demonstrated that human connection and mutual support can overcome limitations that seem insurmountable. When faced individually, the war continued for another year, but Clara and Stone's partnership had established precedents that influenced Confederate medical and tactical doctrine for the remainder of the conflict. Clara's healing abilities were integrated into field medical operations that prioritized personal connection and emotional support alongside conventional treatment, while Stone's tactical innovations led to the development of specialized reconnaissance units that utilize soldiers with unique capabilities. Most importantly, their relationship had proven that healing involved more than medical technique or supernatural ability. It required authentic human connection that transcended individual limitations and circumstances. Clara's muteness and Stone's emotional numbness had initially isolated them from normal human experience, but their partnership had created new forms of connection that enhanced both their abilities and their humanity. In the quiet moments between medical duties and military operations, Clara and Stone continued to explore the relationship that had grown from shared isolation to mutual support to something approaching love. Stone's gradual recovery of emotional capacity paralleled Clara's evolution from individual healer to someone who could inspire healing in others, creating a partnership that multiplied their individual gifts. The field hospital, where their story had begun, received them as heroes whose achievements had transcended the immediate military situation to demonstrate new possibilities for human cooperation under impossible circumstances. Dr. Hartwell's documentation of their partnership became required reading in medical schools throughout the post-war period, influencing generations of physicians who learned that healing required not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about human nature and the courage to form genuine connections with those they served. Clara's gentle touch had indeed healed war wounds, but her greatest achievement was discovering that healing worked both ways, that in caring for others with complete selflessness, she had found wholeness within herself and helped Stone discover emotional connections he thought he had lost forever. Their story became a testament to the power of human compassion to overcome any obstacle and transform even the most desperate circumstances into opportunities for growth, healing, and hope. The war eventually ended, but the lessons Clara and Stone had taught about healing, sacrifice, and human connection continued to influence medical practice and military doctrine for generations. Their partnership had proven that the most powerful healing came not from supernatural abilities or medical techniques, but from the willingness to see others as fully human and deserving of compassion, regardless of circumstances. In a world torn apart by conflict, a mute girl's gentle touch and a soldier's recovered capacity for feeling had demonstrated that healing was always possible when people were willing to reach across their differences and limitations to support each other with authentic care and unwavering commitment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.